Welcome everyone to my channel. He was a law student, handsome, articulate, and well-liked. Women found him charming. Colleagues thought he had a bright future. He volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline where he spent his nights talking desperate strangers out of taking their own lives. By day, that description was completely true. By night, across 7 states, that same man was hunting women, luring them close with a fake injury and a friendly smile, then killing them in ways too brutal to fully describe. He escaped police custody not once, but twice. He represented himself in court, on television, in front of the entire country, in what became the first fully televised criminal trial in American history. He proposed marriage to his girlfriend in the middle of his own murder trial, using a legal loophole to make it official on the spot, in front of the same jury deciding whether he would live or die. He confessed to 30 murders in the final hours before his execution. Investigators believe the real number could be twice that, or more. Even his own family, and the woman who married him during his trial, insisted for years that they had never seen even a hint of what he was capable of. In the year 2026, decades after his death, new DNA evidence is still confirming victims nobody had ever officially connected to him. This is the complete story of Theodore Robert Bundy, one of the most prolific and most studied serial killers in American history. Who he killed, how he was finally caught, and why even now we still don't know the true number of lives he took. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We cover real true crime cases every week. And if you're already subscribed, tap that like button. It helps this video reach more people who only know the outline of this story. Now let's start at the very beginning. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, to a 22-year-old single mother named Eleanor Louise Cowell. His father's identity was never confirmed, and Bundy himself would go the rest of his life without ever learning who his biological father actually was. For the first years of his life, Ted was raised believing his grandparents were actually his parents, and that his own mother was his older sister. This arrangement, common at the time for families trying to avoid the social stigma attached to unmarried mothers, was eventually revealed to him as a teenager, after his mother had moved with him to Tacoma, Washington, and changed both their last names, a discovery that, according to people close to him, left him deeply angry and unsettled. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, has been described by multiple biographers as a man with a violent, unpredictable temper, known to abuse animals, employees, and family members alike. Some of Bundy's own biographers have speculated, based on statements from people close to the family, that his grandfather may in fact have been his biological father, and that his birth may have resulted from an assault within his own family, a theory Bundy's mother always denied, insisting instead that his father had simply been a war veteran who abandoned her. His grandmother suffered from severe depression and agoraphobia, and reportedly received electroconvulsive therapy for it. On the surface, though, Bundy's upbringing looked ordinary. He did well in school, he was intelligent, well-spoken, and eventually went on to study psychology at the University of Washington, where he graduated in 1972. Later, he enrolled in law school, first at the University of Puget Sound and then at the University of Utah, building the kind of resume that, on paper, suggested a stable, promising future. By every outward appearance, Ted Bundy was on a promising path, the kind of quietly impressive man that neighbors, professors, and colleagues would later struggle to reconcile with what he was actually doing in the hours and days nobody was watching him. Psychologists and biographers who have studied Bundy's early adulthood point to several recurring threads that seem to shape the person he eventually became. As a teenager, he reportedly engaged in peeping through neighbors' windows and shoplifting, quiet, isolated behaviors that, according to psychologist Al Carlisle, who studied Bundy extensively, reflected a growing need for control that had no healthy outlet. Carlisle, who interviewed Bundy at length during his time in the Utah prison system, would later say he did not believe Bundy was born a psychopath, but rather that a slow accumulation of loneliness, rejection, and unresolved anger gradually shaped him into one over the course of his adolescence and early adulthood. Bundy later admitted to an escalating fascination with violent pornography throughout his adolescence and adulthood, which he himself pointed to decades later as a contributing factor in his own crimes. In his early 20s, Bundy fell deeply for a University of Washington student, described in various accounts simply as Stephanie. She ultimately ended the relationship, reportedly telling him he lacked ambition and direction. Friends and biographers alike have pointed to that rejection as a turning point, one that seemed to trigger a period of bitterness, isolation, and reinvention. Bundy transformed himself over the following years, becoming more politically engaged, more image-conscious, and more confident, working on a Washington gubernatorial campaign and cultivating relationships with influential people in state politics. When he crossed paths with Stephanie again years later, some accounts suggest he deliberately courted and then abruptly abandoned her, apparently as a calculated act of revenge for the rejection he had never fully processed. By the early 1970s, Bundy had settled into a long-term relationship with a single mother named Elizabeth Kendall, who remained his girlfriend for several years, entirely unaware of what he was doing during the periods he disappeared, sometimes for entire weekends at a time, always returning with explanations she had no reason to doubt. He also spent significant time volunteering at a Seattle crisis hotline, where, remarkably, he worked alongside future true crime writer Ann Rule, who would go on to write one of the most well-known books about him, The Stranger Beside Me, having had no idea during their friendship what he was capable of, and describing, years later, just how unsettling it was to realize she had spent night after night sitting beside a killer without ever suspecting a thing. One of the most jarring details of Bundy's early adult life is the sheer contrast between his volunteer work and what he was doing during the same general period. At the Seattle Crisis Clinic, where he worked alongside Ann Rule, Bundy reportedly handled calls from people in genuine crisis with patience and skill, at times talking callers back from the edge of suicide. Rule later described him, during their time working together, as kind, funny, and conscientious, a colleague she trusted enough to ask for a ride home late at night on more than one occasion, never once suspecting that the same gentle, reassuring voice she heard on shift might belong to someone capable of extreme violence. It remains one of the most frequently cited examples among criminologists studying Bundy's case of just how completely a violent predator can compartmentalize different aspects of his own life. Bundy's confirmed killing spree is generally dated to have begun in 1974, though some investigators and researchers believe his violence started earlier, possibly as far back as the late 1960s, with cases that were never conclusively connected to him. In January of 1974, Bundy broke into the basement bedroom of a University of Washington student named Karen Sparks while she slept, beating her severely with a metal rod. Sparks survived the attack, though she suffered permanent brain damage that affected her for the rest of her life. She remains one of the few known Bundy victims to live through an assault by him, and her survival would later provide investigators with rare, direct evidence of just how sudden and vicious his attacks could be. Weeks later, Linda Ann Healy, another University of Washington student known locally for delivering the radio ski report, disappeared from her off-campus home in the early morning hours. Investigators found her bed carefully made, with blood on the pillow, the only immediate sign that anything was wrong, and a detail that suggested a level of calculated composure at odds with the violence that had clearly taken place. Her remains were discovered roughly a year later, alongside those of several other victims, on Taylor Mountain outside Seattle. Over the following months, more women vanished across Washington state, several of them college students, matching a strikingly similar physical description. Attractive, with long dark hair, often parted in the middle, a description that closely resembled Bundy's former girlfriend, Stephanie, and one that investigators, piecing the pattern together only in hindsight, would later treat as one of the clearest signs of his underlying psychological motive. Bundy's approach to selecting and luring victims became, in hindsight, disturbingly consistent, and it is precisely that consistency that eventually allowed investigators, working across multiple states, to recognize they were dealing with a single offender. He would often appear in public places wearing a fake cast or using crutches, presenting himself as injured and in need of help. He would ask a woman to assist him carrying books or a boat or some other object back to his car, playing on ordinary human sympathy to get a stranger close enough to overpower before she had any reason to feel unsafe. It was a method that relied entirely on the assumption, deeply ingrained in most people, that someone who appears vulnerable and asks politely for help poses no threat at all. On July 14, 1974, this method played out in broad daylight, in full view of hundreds of other people, at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle. Two women, Janice Ott and Denise Nasland, disappeared from the crowded park within hours of each other, on what was otherwise an ordinary, sunny summer day. Multiple witnesses recalled a merely attractive man, his arm in a sling, who had introduced himself as Ted, and asked several different women for help loading a boat onto his car, some of whom declined and walked away entirely unharmed, unaware of how close they had come to becoming his next victim. His calm, friendly demeanor, combined with his ordinary, non-threatening appearance, meant that even witnesses who later gave police a description of him never imagined they were describing a killer. This was, in many ways, the core of what made Bundy so effective and so difficult to catch for as long as he was. He did not fit any of the profiles investigators or the public expected a predator to fit, and he was intelligent enough to actively exploit that gap between appearance and reality. By the second half of 1974, word of the missing women had spread across the Pacific Northwest, and a genuine sense of panic had set in on college campuses throughout the region. Universities issued warnings advising female students not to walk alone at night. Roommates began escorting each other to classes and libraries. Sales of personal safety devices reportedly increased sharply across the affected areas. Composite sketches based on witness descriptions of Ted circulated widely in local newspapers and on television broadcasts. Yet none of them, on their own, proved specific enough to lead directly to an arrest. Bundy's ordinary, clean-cut appearance meant that the sketches, while broadly accurate, described a type of man so common that thousands of people in the region could plausibly have matched them. By the fall of 1974, Bundy had relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, to begin law school, arriving in a new city with an entirely clean reputation, unknown to local police, and largely unconnected, in the eyes of investigators, to the killings that had just terrorized Washington state. The killings continued and expanded into Utah and Colorado almost immediately. Victims in this period included Melissa Smith, daughter of a Utah police chief, whose case carried a particularly bitter irony given her father's own profession, and Karen Campbell, who vanished from a Colorado ski resort while walking a short distance down a hotel hallway. The geographic spread of the killings, Washington, Oregon, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, made it extraordinarily difficult, in an era without the kind of coordinated computerized law enforcement databases that exist today, for investigators in different states to recognize they might be looking at the same person, allowing Bundy to continue operating for far longer than he likely could have in a more connected investigative environment. Bundy would later tell an FBI agent that he had killed people in 7 different states between 1973 and 1978. California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. A geographic range that, even decades later, remains striking for how far and how frequently he was willing to travel in pursuit of new victims. On August 16, 1975, a Utah Highway Patrol trooper named Bob Hayward pulled Bundy over for suspicious driving after noticing his car circling a quiet residential street late at night. A search of his Volkswagen Beetle turned up a set of tools, including handcuffs, a ski mask, and a crowbar, items that, on their own, might have meant little, but that took on a very different significance once investigators connected Bundy to an attempted kidnapping just weeks earlier. That earlier case involved a woman named Carol Durant, who had survived an attack by a man posing as a police officer near a shopping mall, managing to fight her way out of his car and flag down a passing vehicle for help. She was able to identify Bundy in a lineup, providing investigators with something they had never had before in this case: a living witness willing and able to point directly at him. Her testimony, combined with the items found in his car, led to Bundy's conviction in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He was sentenced to a term of 1 to 15 years in prison. It was, for investigators across multiple states quietly building circumstantial cases against him, the first real crack in Bundy's ability to move undetected. The moment an ordinary traffic stop finally connected a name to a pattern that had, until then, existed only as a loose collection of unsolved disappearances scattered across state lines. While serving his Utah sentence, Bundy was transferred to Colorado to face murder charges connected to the death of Karen Campbell. Acting as his own attorney, a decision that granted him unusual freedoms within the justice system, he was permitted access to the courthouse law library to help prepare his own defense, largely unsupervised. On June 7, 1977, Bundy used that access to escape, jumping from a second-story window of the library and fleeing into the Colorado mountains on foot, with no real plan beyond simply putting distance between himself and custody. He was recaptured 6 days later, exhausted and disoriented, having survived largely by breaking into unoccupied vacation cabins and stealing food and supplies. It should have been the end of any opportunity for him to kill again. It was not. On December 30, 1977, Bundy escaped a second time, this time from the Garfield County Jail in Colorado, having spent weeks deliberately losing weight in order to slip through a small gap in the ceiling of his cell. He climbed through a crawl space above the jailer's own apartment and simply walked out the front door, undetected, into the night. By the time guards realized he was missing, more than 15 hours later, he had already made his way out of the state entirely, first traveling to Chicago, then eventually south. Bundy eventually made his way to Tallahassee, Florida, arriving in a college town filled with exactly the kind of women who had become his consistent targets, using a stolen identity to blend into the community, and even briefly renting a room near the Florida State University campus. What followed over the next several weeks would become some of the most notorious murders of his entire career, marking a clear escalation in both frequency and brutality from anything he had done before. In the early morning hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, having reportedly consumed alcohol earlier that night and lost, at least temporarily, the careful, controlled composure that had defined his earlier attacks. In a matter of minutes, he attacked 4 women, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and severely injuring 2 others in an assault that woke other residents of the house before he fled into the night. The attack was markedly more violent and frenzied than his earlier killings, described by investigators at the time as an outburst of extreme brutality that stood apart even from his prior established pattern, lacking the calculated planning that had characterized most of his previous crimes. Later that same night, only blocks away, Bundy broke into another nearby residence and attacked a 5th woman who survived the assault. 3 weeks later, on February 9, 1978, Bundy abducted woman Kimberly Leach from outside middle school in Lake City, Florida. She would be his final confirmed victim. Her remains were found weeks later in a state park roughly 35 miles away. Because of her age, her murder drew particularly intense public outrage, and it would ultimately become the case prosecutors relied on most heavily to secure Bundy's final death sentence. On February 15, 1978, a Pensacola, Florida police officer named David Lee ran the license plate on a Volkswagen Beetle he'd noticed driving suspiciously through a residential neighborhood late at night. The car came back as stolen. When the officer attempted to make the stop, the driver tried to flee on foot, leading to a brief physical struggle before being subdued and arrested. That driver initially gave a false name, refusing to identify himself, and it was only once he was in custody at the police station that officers began to realize exactly who they had actually caught. That driver was Ted Bundy, arrested not for any of his murders directly, but for driving a stolen vehicle, an almost mundane end to a manhunt that had spanned 7 states, generated national headlines for years, and involved some of the most extensive interstate law enforcement cooperation of its era. The nation's most wanted fugitive had, in the end, been stopped over nothing more than a suspicious-looking car on a quiet residential street. Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders, which began in June of 1979, became the first criminal trial in American history to be fully televised nationally, turning an already infamous case into a genuine media spectacle that drew crowds of spectators, reporters from across the country and around the world, and even groups of women who showed up specifically to watch Bundy in person, some openly expressing admiration for him despite the charges against him, a phenomenon that would later be studied by criminologists as an early, unsettling example of the strange public fascination violent offenders can sometimes generate. Bundy chose to act as his own attorney for significant portions of the proceedings, using the role to project confidence and control in front of the cameras, cross-examining witnesses himself, and delivering portions of his own closing argument. Prosecutors presented bite mark evidence connecting Bundy to one of the Chi Omega victims, one of the earliest major American murder cases to rely heavily on forensic odontology, along with eyewitness testimony from survivors and neighbors. In July of 1979, the jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death. 6 months later, in a separate trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach, prosecutors presented additional evidence, including eyewitness testimony from a firefighter who had seen Bundy leading the woman to his van, along with matching fiber evidence recovered from his vehicle. During the penalty phase of that trial, in a moment that captured the surreal nature of the entire spectacle surrounding Bundy, he proposed marriage to his longtime on-and-off girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, while she was testifying as a defense witness. Because Florida law at the time recognized a declaration of marriage made in front of a notary public as legally binding, the impromptu proposal made them legally married on the spot, in the middle of his own murder trial. Shortly afterward, the jury recommended a second death sentence. The couple would go on to have a daughter together during Bundy's years on death row, before Boone eventually divorced him in 1986. Bundy spent nearly a decade on death row in Florida, during which time his legal team pursued a lengthy series of appeals, ultimately reaching the United States Supreme Court before being exhausted, and multiple execution dates were set and then stayed at the last possible moment, including one stay granted just 15 minutes before he was scheduled to die. During those years, Bundy engaged in extensive conversations with journalists, psychologists, and law enforcement investigators, including FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier, who developed an unusually close working rapport with him over years of interviews. Journalists Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth also conducted extensive recorded interviews with him during this period, later publishing them as a book that offered one of the clearest windows into how Bundy talked about his own crimes, often in the third person, as though describing someone else entirely. Throughout most of this period, Bundy continued to deny any involvement in the murders he had been convicted of, occasionally offering only vague, third-person hypotheticals about how someone might have carried out such crimes, seemingly unable, even privately, to fully own what he had done. That changed only in the final days before his execution. Over January 23rd and 24th, 1989, Bundy finally confessed, in detail, to a series of law enforcement officials representing jurisdictions across the country, ultimately admitting to killing 30 people across the 7 states he had named to Agent Hagmaier. Some investigators believed Bundy used these final confessions strategically, hoping detailed cooperation might buy him additional time before his execution. It did not. Investigators who worked the case for years have said they believe even that number of 30 understates the true scope of his crimes, with some estimates suggesting the real total could be 50 or more. Ted Bundy was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989, at around 7 o'clock in the morning. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, crowds gathered through the night, some setting off fireworks, waving signs, and cheering when the execution was confirmed. An unusually public, celebratory reaction that reflected just how much fear and fascination Bundy had generated across the country during his years of killing, escaping, and standing trial in front of television cameras. For many of the families who had waited years, in some cases over a decade, for any measure of accountability, the scene outside the prison that morning represented a kind of closure that a courtroom verdict alone had never fully provided. He was cremated after his death, per his final wishes, with his ashes reportedly scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, the same region where his very first known killings had taken place more than a decade earlier, closing a strange, grim circle between where his story as a confirmed killer had begun and where it formally ended. For every named victim confirmed to have died at Bundy's hands, there are likely families of other women from the same decade in the same general regions who have never received any confirmation at all about what happened to their daughters, sisters, or friends. Some of these families spent years attending Bundy's trials, hoping for even a passing mention of a name that might finally explain a decades-old disappearance. That uncertainty has never fully gone away. Cold case investigators in multiple states have continued, periodically, to revisit unsolved disappearances from the 1970s that share enough similarities with Bundy's known pattern to warrant another look, even decades after his death, using DNA and forensic techniques that simply did not exist when the original cases went cold. Even decades after his execution, the exact number of Ted Bundy's victims remains genuinely unresolved, one of the strangest, lingering uncertainties in modern American criminal history. He confessed to 30. Some biographers and investigators, drawing on inconsistencies in his own statements and unresolved missing persons cases from the same period and regions, have suggested the real number could be well over 100. Bundy himself, according to those who interviewed him at length, appeared to deliberately withhold information about certain victims, seemingly treating his own body count as a final source of leverage and control, even as he faced execution. Criminologist Matt DeLisi, in a 2023 book-length study, argued that the true total likely exceeds 100 victims, a claim supported by several other researchers who have studied the case in depth, based on cross-referencing missing persons reports from the states and time periods where Bundy is known to have traveled. Investigators have continued working to close out cases connected to Bundy even decades after his death, using modern forensic techniques that did not exist during his lifetime. As recently as March of 2026, DNA evidence formally confirmed that Bundy was responsible for the 1974 murder of Laura Ann Amy, who had last been seen alive at a Halloween party on October 31st of that year, a case that had remained technically unresolved, at least in a formal forensic sense, for more than half a century, standing as proof that even a case this thoroughly investigated and a killer this widely studied can still yield new, confirmable answers decades after the fact. Bundy's years on death row were, by multiple accounts, spent maintaining a strange sense of normalcy amid his circumstances. In letters to journalists and acquaintances during this period, he described a controlled daily routine: exercise, reading, correspondence, and long stretches of isolation in a small cell, at one point comparing his own confinement with apparent seriousness to the imprisonment of Mahatma Gandhi. He continued for years to insist on his innocence in public and written correspondence, even while privately hinting in conversations with investigators like Agent Hagmeyer at a far darker truth. This dual persona, the calm, articulate correspondent in his letters, and the calculated predator investigators knew him to be, persisted almost until the very end, reinforcing just how thoroughly Bundy had spent his entire adult life compartmentalizing the two halves of who he was. Ted Bundy's case reshaped how both law enforcement and the public think about serial killers, and its influence is still visible today, decades after his execution. His ability to appear ordinary, even charming, directly challenged the prevailing assumption that violent predators were easy to spot, an assumption that had genuinely shaped how police approached suspect identification up until that point. That challenge helped drive the development of more sophisticated criminal profiling techniques within the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, and contributed to the eventual creation of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, a national database designed specifically to help investigators in different jurisdictions recognize when they might be looking at the work of the same offender, the exact kind of coordination that had been so critically absent During the years Bundy was actively killing across 7 different states, moving faster than the disconnected, paper-based systems of the time could ever hope to track him. His case also fed directly into popular culture for decades afterward, widely cited as a partial inspiration for the fictional serial killer Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, and the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and dramatized films in the years since his execution, including a widely watched Netflix docuseries built around his own recorded prison interviews. Academics studying true crime as a genre have pointed to Bundy's case repeatedly as one of the clearest examples of how media coverage can inadvertently glamorize a violent offender, given how many of his own contemporaries, including women who attended his trial, openly expressed fascination or attraction toward him, despite the horror of what he had done. For the families of his confirmed victims, and for the families of the many more women whose disappearances have never been definitively connected to him, Ted Bundy's story remains a stark, unsettling reminder that some of the most dangerous people are the ones who never look dangerous at all. He spent years hiding in plain sight, working ordinary jobs, dating ordinary women, volunteering to help strangers in crisis, sounding by every account like an entirely reasonable, likable person. And for at least 30 confirmed victims, and very possibly dozens more whose names may never be connected to him at all, that ordinary appearance was the last thing they ever saw.